In 1980, a woman worth $350 million walked away from a life of extraordinary privilege and simply vanished. For 20 years, she remained one of America's most baffling missing persons cases. Then, in the year 2000, a social worker discovered her living on the streets with only $5 to her name. But this wasn't a kidnapping. It wasn't murder. What drove Margaret Ashford to abandon everything? Why did she choose poverty over wealth? And what secret was she protecting all those years? Margaret Eleanor Ashford was born into money so old it had lost count of itself. Her great-grandfather had made his fortune in railroads during the 1880s, and each generation had carefully multiplied that wealth through steel oil and eventually technology investments. By 1980, the Ashford Family Trust was valued at just over $1 billion, with Margaret controlling roughly a third of that fortune as the family's primary heir. She was 35 years old, unmarried, and living in a 12-room penthouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side. To anyone looking from the outside, Margaret had everything a person could possibly want. She attended charity galas in designer gowns, served on the boards of 3 major museums, and was frequently photographed at society events. But the woman in those photographs always looked slightly uncomfortable, as if the camera had caught her in the middle of deciding whether to stay or leave. That expression, it turned out, was more telling than anyone realized at the time. The last confirmed sighting of Margaret Ashford occurred on August 14, 1980. It was a Thursday evening, unusually humid for that time of year in New York City. Her personal assistant, Dorothy Jensen, had helped her prepare for a dinner with the family's financial advisors at an exclusive restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. Margaret had seemed distracted that evening, Dorothy later told investigators. She had changed her outfit 3 times before settling on a conservative navy blue dress with long sleeves and a high neckline, very different from her usual elegant style. She wore minimal jewelry, just a strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. Dorothy remembered thinking it was odd that Margaret hadn't worn her usual diamond earrings or any of her expensive rings. But the evening was running late, and Dorothy had assumed Margaret simply wanted to keep things simple. Margaret left the penthouse at 7:15 in a private car driven by her regular chauffeur, Thomas Brennan. The dinner reservation was for 8 o'clock. Thomas drove her to the restaurant, watched her walk inside, and then parked nearby to wait. He would wait until nearly midnight before calling Dorothy in a panic. Thomas Brennan told police that he had expected Margaret to be at dinner for 2 or 3 hours at most. When 4 hours passed without any word from her, he became concerned. He walked to the restaurant entrance and asked the maitre d' about Mrs. Ashford's party. That's when Thomas learned something shocking. Margaret had never sat down for dinner. She had walked through the front entrance of the restaurant, continued straight through the dining room as if looking for someone, and exited through a side door that led to an alley. The maitre d' had assumed she was stepping out to make a phone call or meet someone outside. But Margaret Ashford never came back through that door. She had simply walked into a Manhattan alley and disappeared. Thomas immediately called Dorothy, who contacted Margaret's family attorney, Walter Harrison. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the New York Police Department had been notified. Within hours, the story had made the news. The heiress to one of America's great fortunes had vanished under circumstances that made no sense to anyone. The initial investigation moved quickly, but found almost nothing. Detective Robert Coaster, a 25-year veteran of the NYPD, was assigned to lead the case. He interviewed everyone who knew Margaret, starting with her closest family members. Her father, William Ashford, was 72 years old and suffering from early-stage dementia. He seemed confused by the questions, asking repeatedly when Margaret would be coming to visit him. Her mother had died 10 years earlier from cancer. Margaret had one younger brother, Jonathan Ashford, who lived in Connecticut with his wife and 3 children. Jonathan told Detective Costa that he and his sister had never been particularly close. She called him on birthdays and holidays, sent expensive gifts to his children, but they rarely spent time together. He couldn't think of any reason why she would disappear. He suggested that perhaps she had been kidnapped, though he admitted that seemed unlikely given the circumstances. Margaret's financial advisors were equally baffled. Her accounts showed no unusual activity in the weeks before her disappearance. She hadn't liquidated any assets or transferred large sums of money anywhere. Everything appeared completely normal. Dorothy Jensen provided the most detailed picture of Margaret's state of mind in the days before she vanished. Dorothy had worked as Margaret's personal assistant for 8 years, and probably knew her better than anyone else in her life. She told Detective Coaster that Margaret had seemed increasingly withdrawn over the past several months. She had stopped attending many of her usual social obligations, often cancelling at the last minute with vague excuses about not feeling well. She had also started spending more time alone in her penthouse, reading philosophy books and writing in a journal that she kept locked in her desk. Dorothy had once asked Margaret if everything was all right, and Margaret had given her a sad smile and said something Dorothy would never forget. "Have you ever felt like your whole life is a beautiful prison, Dorothy? Like you're trapped inside a painting that everyone admires, but you can't breathe?" Dorothy hadn't known how to respond to that. She had simply assured Margaret that everyone felt overwhelmed sometimes, and that perhaps she needed a vacation. Margaret had thanked her and changed the subject. Now, looking back, Dorothy wondered if that conversation had been a cry for help she had failed to recognize. The investigation expanded to include the FBI within a week. Given the size of Margaret's fortune and the possibility of kidnapping, Special Agent Patricia Morgan took over coordination between local and federal authorities. The first theory they pursued was that Margaret had been abducted, possibly by someone who knew her routine and had been waiting for an opportunity. But this theory fell apart quickly. There was no ransom demand. No one had contacted the family asking for money. Security cameras in the area around the restaurant showed Margaret walking down the alley alone, her pace steady and purposeful, not hurried or fearful. She appeared to be leaving of her own free will. The alley led to a busy street where she could have caught a taxi or walked to the nearest subway station. From that point, her trail went completely cold. Agent Morgan ordered a review of Margaret's phone records, credit card statements, and banking activity. Everything remained dormant. She wasn't using her money or making any calls. It was as if she had stepped out of her life and ceased to exist. The investigation continued for months, but with no new leads, it eventually went quiet. Margaret Ashford became another name in the files of unsolved disappearances. What the investigators didn't know at the time was that Margaret had been planning her disappearance for nearly a year. She had done so carefully, methodically, making sure to leave no obvious trail. In the months before she vanished, Margaret had been visiting a therapist named Dr. Helen Sutherland. These visits were not covered by insurance and were paid for in cash, leaving no paper trail connecting Margaret to the therapy sessions. Years later, after Margaret was found, Dr. Sutherland would finally be able to share what she knew, bound no longer by client confidentiality once Margaret gave permission. Dr. Sutherland revealed that Margaret had been suffering from severe depression and anxiety, conditions that had plagued her since her teenage years, but which she had hidden from everyone around her. The pressure of being an Ashford, of living up to family expectations, of managing enormous wealth while feeling empty inside, all of it had become unbearable. Margaret had told Dr. Sutherland that she felt like she was suffocating under the weight of her own privilege, that every luxury felt like another chain binding her to a life she didn't want. During their therapy sessions, Margaret had explored a troubling question: what would happen if she simply walked away from everything? Dr. Sutherland had tried to help Margaret find ways to live authentically within her circumstances, to perhaps use her wealth to pursue passions that gave her life meaning. But Margaret had seemed convinced that the only way to find peace was to leave behind everything associated with the Ashford name. She talked about wanting to know who she was without the money, without the expectations, without the constant attention. She wondered if she could survive in the real world, the world where most people lived without trust funds and penthouses. Dr. Sutherland had tried to explain that running away wouldn't solve the underlying issues, that Margaret would carry her depression and anxiety with her wherever she went. But Margaret had grown increasingly fixated on the idea of disappearance. In their final session, just 2 weeks before Margaret vanished, she had seemed almost calm for the first time in months. Dr. Sutherland had worried about that calmness. In her experience, people who had made a final decision often experienced a sense of relief. She had tried to schedule another appointment, but Margaret had said she needed some time to think. She never came back. On the evening of August 14th, 1980, Margaret Ashford walked through that restaurant and out into a New York alley with a specific plan. She walked 4 blocks to a public storage facility she had rented under a false name 2 months earlier. Inside the storage unit was a small suitcase containing simple, Unremarkable clothing, jeans, plain shirts, a worn jacket, nothing that would mark her as wealthy. She had also stored $5,000 in cash, divided into small bills. She changed out of her navy dress in the storage unit bathroom, leaving her expensive clothes folded neatly inside. She removed her grandmother's pearls and placed them carefully in a plastic bag with a note that simply said, "Return to the Ashford family." She had planned to mail it from somewhere far away. Then she walked to Port Authority bus terminal, purchased a ticket to Pittsburgh with cash, and boarded a bus that left at midnight. She sat in a window seat near the back, watching the lights of New York City fade behind her. For the first time in as long as she could remember, Margaret felt like she could breathe. Margaret spent the first year moving from city to city, working odd jobs that paid cash and asked no questions. She worked as a dishwasher in a Pittsburgh diner, a hotel housekeeper in Cleveland, a grocery store stock clerk in Indianapolis. She went by different names, sometimes Mary, sometimes Maggie, once even using the name Eleanor after her middle name. She lived in cheap motels or rented rooms in boarding houses that didn't require background checks or references. The $5,000 she had taken lasted longer than she expected, but eventually she had to rely entirely on what she earned. The work was exhausting. Her hands became rough and calloused, and she lived in a constant state of physical tiredness that was very different from the mental exhaustion she had known as Margaret Ashford. But there was something clarifying about it. When she was scrubbing dishes or cleaning hotel rooms, she wasn't thinking about family obligations or social expectations. She was simply trying to get through the day. She was surviving, and survival left no room for the anxiety that had once consumed her. For the first time in her life, nobody expected anything from her except the work she was being paid to do. But mental illness doesn't disappear just because circumstances change. By the end of her second year away from her old life, Margaret's depression began to deepen again. The initial relief of escape had faded, and she was left alone with her thoughts in a way she had never experienced before. She had no friends, no real connections with anyone. The loneliness was profound. She started sleeping more and eating less. The jobs became harder to hold down as her energy declined. She lost her position at a restaurant in St. Louis after showing up late too many times. She couldn't afford her room at a boarding house and found herself sleeping in her car, an old vehicle she had purchased for $300. When the car broke down and she couldn't afford repairs, she lost that too. Gradually, inevitably, Margaret descended into homelessness. It wasn't a dramatic fall, it happened slowly, one small disaster after another. A missed rent payment, an illness that cost her a job, a theft that took the last of her money. By 1983, 3 years after her disappearance, Margaret was living on the streets of Chicago. The woman who once had $350 million now owned nothing but the clothes she wore and a small backpack containing a blanket and a few personal items. The years that followed became a blur of survival. Margaret, who now went only by Maggie, moved from city to city as the seasons changed, heading south in winter and north in summer. She learned the unwritten rules of homelessness, where to find free meals, which shelters were safe and which were dangerous, how to become invisible to the people who walked past her every day. She learned that eye contact could be dangerous or kind, depending on the person. She learned to recognize other homeless individuals by their posture and their silence, the way they carried themselves. She made a few temporary friends, people she would share a meal with or sleep near for safety in numbers, but these connections never lasted long. People disappeared, moved on, or fell into addictions or illness. The homeless community was transient by nature. Maggie herself struggled with periods of deep depression where she could barely function. There were days when she couldn't remember why she had left her old life, couldn't remember what she had been trying to prove. There were nights when she thought about walking into a police station and telling them who she was, asking them to take her home. But she never did. Something kept her on the streets, some stubborn determination to see this through, even as she lost track of what this was. In 1995, 15 years after her disappearance, Maggie found herself in Seattle. She had been living in a tent encampment under a highway overpass, part of a community of about 30 homeless individuals who had created a fragile society of mutual protection. She was 50 years old now, though she looked much older. Her hair had turned grey and she kept it cut short with scissors she had found. Her face was weathered from years of sun exposure and inadequate nutrition. Her teeth ached constantly from lack of dental care. She had lost weight until she was almost skeletal. The expensive education, the refined manners, the cultured accent, all of it had been worn away by nearly 2 decades of extreme poverty. When she spoke now, which was rarely, she sounded rough and tired. A social worker named James Patterson came through the encampment regularly, bringing food and offering information about services available to the homeless population. James was in his 30s, idealistic and determined to make a difference. He had noticed Maggie because she was one of the few people who would accept food, but always refused his offers of help getting into a shelter or applying for benefits. When he asked why, she would just shake her head and walk away. But James was persistent, and over months of regular visits, he gradually earned her trust enough that she would at least have brief conversations with him. James Patterson could tell that Maggie was different from many of the other homeless individuals he worked with. Despite her rough appearance and obvious poverty, there was something about the way she carried herself, the words she chose when she did speak, that suggested she had come from a very different life. He asked her once if she had family anywhere who might help her, and she had given him a look of such profound sadness that he hadn't asked again. But James couldn't stop thinking about her. Something about her case nagged at him. He started researching long-term missing persons, looking through old news articles and cold case files, trying to match the woman he knew as Maggie to someone who had disappeared years ago. It was a long shot, he knew. There were thousands of missing persons cases, and many homeless individuals were simply people who had fallen through society's cracks, without ever being officially reported missing. But James had a gut feeling about Maggie. He spent his evenings going through databases and newspaper archives from the 1980s, looking for any woman who matched her approximate age and description. For months, he found nothing. Then late one night in October of 1999, he came across a news article from August of 1980 about a missing New York heiress named Margaret Ashford. James stared at the photograph in the old newspaper article for a long time. It showed a beautiful, elegant woman in her 30s, dressed in an expensive gown at some charity event, smiling politely at the camera. Her hair was styled perfectly, she wore diamond jewelry, and everything about her screamed wealth and privilege. James tried to reconcile that image with the weathered, grey-haired homeless woman he knew as Maggie. The bone structure of the face seemed similar, the shape of the eyes, the set of the mouth. But nearly 20 years and unimaginable hardship separated these two images. Could they really be the same person? James knew he needed to be certain before saying anything to Maggie or to the authorities. He couldn't risk traumatizing her or getting her hopes up if he was wrong. He printed out several photographs of Margaret Ashford from different angles and times, trying to compare them to mental images of Maggie. The more he looked, the more convinced he became. This had to be her. The missing heiress and the homeless woman were the same person. But James knew that approaching this situation would require extreme care. If Maggie really was Margaret Ashford, she had been living homeless for nearly 2 decades, when she could have returned to enormous wealth at any time. That suggested serious mental health issues and a deliberate choice to stay hidden. James decided he needed professional guidance. He contacted Dr. Susan Chen, a psychiatrist who specialized in working with homeless populations and understanding trauma. He explained the situation, that he believed he had found a long-missing heiress living on the streets, but he didn't know how to approach her without causing harm. Dr. Chen agreed to help. Together, they developed a careful plan. They would not confront Maggie directly with the question of her identity. Instead, Dr. Chen would begin visiting the encampment with James, simply offering mental health services to anyone who wanted them. Over time, she would try to build a relationship with Maggie, earning her trust gradually. Only when Maggie seemed stable and ready would they broach the subject of her past. This process took months. Chen visited the encampment every week through the winter of 1999 and into the spring of 2000. Slowly, carefully, she convinced Maggie to start having regular conversations with her. They talked about life on the streets, about survival, about the daily challenges of being homeless. Chen never pushed, never pried too deeply. She simply listened and offered gentle support. By the early summer of 2000, Maggie had begun to open up about her depression and her overwhelming sense of not belonging anywhere. She still hadn't mentioned her past or her real identity, but Dr. Chen could sense they were approaching a breakthrough. In July of 2000, 20 years after Margaret Ashford had vanished from that Manhattan alley, Dr. Chen finally asked Maggie the question they had been building toward for months. They were sitting together in a quiet corner of a community centre where Dr. Chen conducted some of her sessions. Maggie had agreed to come inside, out of the summer heat. For the first time, Dr. Chen had made tea, and they sat in comfortable chairs rather than on the ground. After some gentle conversation, Dr. Chen said quietly, "Maggie, I've been wondering something. Is that your real name?" The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute. Maggie stared at her tea, her hands wrapped around the cup for warmth despite the summer temperature outside. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "No, it's not my real name." Dr. Chen waited, giving her space. "My real name is Margaret," she continued, her voice shaking. "Margaret Eleanor Ashford. I left my life 20 years ago, and I've been living on the streets ever since." She looked up at Dr. Chen with tears in her eyes. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know if I'm Margaret or Maggie or nobody at all." Dr. Chen's response was crucial. She didn't express shock or judgment. She simply said, "Thank you for trusting me with that, Margaret. Can you tell me why you left?" Over the next several sessions, Margaret began to tell her story. She described the suffocating pressure of being an Ashford, the depression that had plagued her since adolescence, the feeling that she was living someone else's life while her real self was trapped inside screaming. She described her therapy sessions with Dr. Sutherland, the growing conviction that escape was her only option. She explained how she had planned her disappearance and executed it, how the first year of freedom had felt like relief, and how the years after that had descended into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She talked about losing everything, including herself. Dr. Chen listened to all of this, and then asked a question that Margaret had been avoiding for 20 years. "What do you want to do now?" Margaret didn't have an answer. Part of her wanted to go home, to reclaim her identity and her life. But another part of her was terrified of going back, of stepping back into the role of Margaret Ashford after all these years. She had failed at being Margaret. She had also failed at being Maggie. Who would she be if she tried to go back? Would anyone even recognize her? Would they want her back? Dr. Chen helped Margaret understand that she didn't have to make any immediate decisions. They could take things slowly, one step at a time. The first priority was getting Margaret stabilized, proper nutrition, medical care, dental work, treatment for her depression. Dr. Chen helped Margaret move into a supervised housing facility that provided support for homeless individuals transitioning back into stability. It was a small private room, the first time Margaret had slept indoors regularly in over 15 years. She began taking medication for her depression and seeing Dr. Chen 3 times a week for therapy. Slowly, gradually, Margaret started to look more like herself. She gained weight. Her hair grew out and she began taking care of it again. The grey remained, but it looked healthy rather than neglected. She started wearing clothes that fit properly rather than layers of whatever she could find. After 3 months of this careful preparation, Margaret told Dr. Chen she was ready to contact her family. Dr. Chen helped her compose a letter to her brother Jonathan. It was brief and simple. "This is Margaret. I'm alive and I'm ready to come home. I'm sorry for everything. Please call me at this number." James Patterson, who had been visiting Margaret regularly throughout her recovery, agreed to be present when she made the phone call to Jonathan after sending the letter. Neither of them knew what kind of reception she would receive. Jonathan Ashford received his sister's letter on a Tuesday morning in October of 2000. He stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it, recognizing immediately the careful handwriting he hadn't seen in 20 years. When he read the brief message inside, he sat down heavily in his kitchen chair. His wife, Linda, found him there an hour later, still holding the letter, tears running down his face. He had long ago accepted that his sister was dead, had mourned her and moved on with his life. Now she was back alive and asking to come home. He called the number she had provided with shaking hands. Dr. Chen answered, explained who she was and what had happened over the past few months, and then handed the phone to Margaret. Brother and sister spoke for the first time in 2 decades. Their conversation was awkward and emotional. Jonathan asked her where she had been, why she had stayed away, if she was all right. Margaret answered as best she could, her voice hoarse with emotion. She apologized over and over. Jonathan kept saying it was okay, that none of that mattered, that he was just glad she was alive. He wanted to see her immediately. They arranged to meet the following week in Seattle, neutral ground where Margaret felt safe. Jonathan would come alone without Linda or his children, to avoid overwhelming Margaret. When the call ended, Margaret sat in silence for a long time. She had taken the first step back toward her old life. There was no turning back now. The reunion between Margaret and Jonathan took place in a private room at the community centre where Dr. Chen worked. Chen and James Patterson were present to provide support if needed. When Jonathan walked into the room and saw his sister for the first time in 20 years, he stopped in his tracks. Margaret stood slowly, her hands trembling. They looked at each other across the small space, each seeing how much the other had changed. Jonathan was 52 now, his hair greying, his face lined with age and responsibility. Margaret was 55, thin and weathered, looking older than her years. But the recognition was immediate and mutual. Jonathan crossed the room and pulled his sister into a careful embrace, and they both began to cry. They held each other for a long time while Dr. Chen and James quietly stepped out of the room to give them privacy. When they finally pulled apart and sat down to talk, Jonathan had 1,000 questions. Margaret did her best to answer them, though there were some things she still couldn't fully explain, even to herself. Why had she stayed away so long? She didn't really know. Pride, maybe fear, the feeling that she had gone too far down a path to turn back. Jonathan listened to it all without judgment, though Margaret could see the pain in his eyes. Her disappearance had hurt him deeply, even if he tried to hide it. Jonathan explained what had happened to the family in the years after Margaret vanished. Their father William had died in 1987, still asking about Margaret even in his final days. The family fortune had been managed by a team of trustees and financial advisors. Margaret's share of the estate, approximately $150 million in 1980, had grown to nearly $250 million by the year 2000 through careful investments. It was all still there, waiting for her if she wanted to reclaim it. The penthouse had been sold years ago, but there were other properties, bank accounts, stocks and bonds. Everything could be transferred back to her control with proper legal documentation proving her identity. But Jonathan wanted to make something clear. He didn't care about the money. He cared about his sister. If she wanted to come back to the family, she was welcome regardless of what she decided to do with her inheritance. If she wanted to walk away from it all again, he would support that too. He just wanted her in his life. Margaret was overwhelmed by his kindness. She had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even rejection, but Jonathan was offering unconditional acceptance. It was more than she felt she deserved. Margaret agreed to return to Connecticut with Jonathan, to stay with him and Linda while she figured out her next steps. The legal process of reclaiming her identity was complex. Because she had been missing for 20 years, there were numerous legal hurdles to overcome. The family's attorneys worked with law enforcement to verify her identity through fingerprints and DNA testing. The results confirmed what everyone already knew. This woman was indeed Margaret Eleanor Ashford, missing since August of 1980. The news broke almost immediately. The media descended on the story with ferocious interest. The missing Heiress, found alive after 20 years, living homeless on the streets, was exactly the kind of sensational story that captured public attention. Reporters camped outside Jonathan's house. News helicopters flew overhead. Everyone wanted an interview, a photograph, a statement. Margaret was horrified by the attention. This was exactly what she had been trying to escape 20 years earlier. Dr. Chen helped her understand that the media frenzy would eventually die down, but in the meantime, they needed to set strict boundaries. Margaret released one brief statement through the family attorneys. "I am grateful to be reunited with my family. I am working on my recovery and ask for privacy during this time. I will not be giving interviews." The statement did little to slow the media interest, but it gave Margaret permission to ignore the attention. Living with Jonathan and Linda was both comforting and strange. They gave Margaret a guest room on the second floor of their comfortable suburban home. It was decorated simply, painted a soft blue with white curtains and basic furniture. To Margaret, it felt almost unbearably luxurious after years of sleeping on the ground or in shelters. She found herself uncomfortable in the bed at first, often sleeping on the floor beside it because it felt more familiar. Linda was endlessly kind and patient, giving Margaret space when she needed it, but also including her in family activities. Jonathan's 3 children, now adults themselves in their 20s, were awkward around their mysterious aunt at first. They had grown up hearing stories about the aunt who disappeared before they were born. Now she was here, real and human and complicated. Gradually, over weeks and months, they all found their way toward a tentative relationship. Margaret started seeing a local therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. She continued taking medication for her depression. She began to put on weight and look healthier, but the transition was not easy. There were days when she felt trapped again, suffocated by the comfort and the expectations, even the kind ones. On those days, she would walk for hours through the Connecticut suburbs, feeling the pull of the streets, the strange longing for the simplicity of having nothing. One of the hardest aspects of Margaret's return was facing the reality of what she had left behind. The family's attorneys needed her to review financial documents and make decisions about her estate. Margaret found herself sitting in conference rooms with expensive leather chairs, looking at spreadsheets showing numbers so large they felt abstract and meaningless. $250 million. It was more money than she could comprehend, more than any person could possibly need, yet it belonged to her. Walter Harrison, the family attorney who had been involved in the original investigation of her disappearance, sat across from her with an expression of professional neutrality. But Margaret could see the questions in his eyes. How could someone walk away from this? Why would anyone choose poverty over this kind of security? Margaret didn't have answers that would satisfy him. She tried to explain that the money had felt like a burden, that she had needed to know who she was without it. Walter nodded politely but clearly didn't understand. To him, money was freedom. To Margaret, it had been a prison. Eventually, they worked out a compromise. Margaret would take control of her finances again, but she would put most of the money into charitable trusts. She kept $5 million for herself, enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly. The rest would go to organizations helping homeless individuals, funding mental health services, and supporting others struggling with the kinds of issues she had faced. The news media eventually found James Patterson and Dr. Susan Chen, the social worker and psychiatrist who had helped Margaret during her transition. They were both offered substantial sums of money for exclusive interviews about their time working with Margaret. Both refused. James did agree to one brief statement to a reputable newspaper, saying only that he was glad to have been able to help Margaret find her way home, and that her story highlighted the important work that needed to be done for the homeless community. Dr. Chen maintained strict professional confidentiality and said nothing publicly about Margaret's case. Margaret was grateful for their discretion. She knew that both James and Dr. Chen could have profited significantly from her story, but they had chosen to protect her privacy instead. She met with them both several months after returning to Connecticut, wanting to thank them properly. James told her that seeing her recovery was thanks enough. Dr. Chen said something that struck Margaret deeply. "You were never really lost, Margaret. You were always trying to find yourself. You just had to take a very hard path to get there." Margaret thought about those words often in the months that followed. Had she really found herself? Or was she still searching, still trying to figure out who she was supposed to be? In the spring of 2001, almost a year after her identity had been revealed, Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She decided to go back to Seattle, not to live on the streets, but to work with the homeless community that had been her home for so many years. She purchased a small house in a modest neighborhood, nothing fancy or ostentatious, just a comfortable place that felt like home. She began volunteering at the community center where she had first met James and Dr. Chen. She served meals at shelters, distributed clothing and supplies, and most importantly, simply talked with people who were living the life she had lived. She understood them in a way that no other wealthy donor could. She knew the daily indignities, the constant fear, the overwhelming exhaustion that came with homelessness. She knew how it felt to be invisible, to have people walk past you as if you didn't exist. The homeless individuals she worked with knew her story, of course. The news coverage had been too widespread for her to remain anonymous. But they didn't treat her like a curiosity or a celebrity. They treated her like someone who understood, someone who had been there. That acceptance meant more to Margaret than all the money in her bank account. Margaret also reconnected with Dr. Helen Sutherland, the therapist she had been seeing back in 1980 before she disappeared. Dr. Sutherland was now 78 years old and retired, but she agreed to meet with Margaret one afternoon at a quiet cafe. They sat together for hours, drinking tea and talking about everything that had happened in the 20 years since their last session. Dr. Sutherland admitted that Margaret's disappearance had haunted her for decades. She had wondered if she could have done something differently, if she could have prevented Margaret from running away. Margaret assured her that nothing could have stopped her at that point. She had been determined to escape, and she had found a way to do it. Dr. Sutherland asked Margaret if she had found what she was looking for during those 20 years on the streets. Margaret thought carefully before answering. "I don't know if I found what I was looking for," she said slowly, "but I learned something important. I learned that you can't run away from yourself. No matter how far you go or how much you give up, you take yourself with you. The depression, the anxiety, the questions about who you are, they don't disappear just because your circumstances change." Dr. Sutherland nodded, her eyes sad. "That's a hard lesson to learn," she said. Margaret smiled slightly. "Yes, very expensive. I lost 20 years, I can't get them back." But Margaret also told Dr. Sutherland that she didn't entirely regret what had happened. This statement seemed to surprise the therapist. "I'm not saying I would do it again," Margaret clarified. "If I could go back to August of 1980 and make a different choice, I probably would. I would stay in therapy, try medication, work harder to find meaning in my life as Margaret Ashford. But I can't go back, and given everything that happened, I think I learned things about myself and about life that I never would have learned otherwise. I learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was. I survived 20 years with nothing. I learned compassion for people who are struggling, real compassion that comes from shared experience, not just intellectual understanding. I learned that money doesn't make you happy, but it doesn't make you unhappy either. It's just a tool. What matters is who you are and how you use what you have." Dr. Sutherland listened to all of this, and then said something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. "You know, Margaret, I think you might be the first person I've ever met who truly knows the value of a dollar. Most people who have never been poor can't really understand money, and most people who have always been poor can only dream about having it. But you've lived on both extremes. You know exactly what money can and can't do." The $5 bill that had been found in Margaret's pocket when her identity was revealed had become something of a symbol. The news media had focused on that detail, the heiress worth $250 million, found with only $5 to her name. The contrast was stark and dramatic, but what the news reports didn't mention was what Margaret did with that $5 bill. She had kept it, not in a bank vault or a frame, but in her wallet, where she could see it every day. When people asked her why she kept such a small amount of money, she would explain, "That $5 represents everything I had when I was at my lowest point. It reminds me that my value as a person isn't connected to my bank account. Whether I have $5 or $5 million, I'm still the same person. That's important for me to remember." She also kept a photograph of herself from her homeless years, taken by a journalist who had been doing a story on homelessness before anyone knew who she was. In the photo, Margaret looks tired and worn, her hair grey and tangled, her clothes dirty, sitting against a concrete pillar with that $5 bill visible on a cloth in front of her. She keeps this photo next to a photograph from her society days, a glossy portrait from a charity gala where she's wearing diamonds and an evening gown. Both images are her. Both are true. She is both of these people, and learning to accept that has been the hardest and most important work of her recovery. Margaret's brother Jonathan visited her in Seattle in the spring of 2002. He wanted to see how she was doing, to understand the new life she was building for herself. He was initially skeptical about her decision to live so modestly and spend so much time working with the homeless community. Wasn't this just another extreme? Another way of running away from being a full person? But as he spent time with Margaret, watching her work at the shelter and interact with the people there, he began to understand. This wasn't about running away anymore. This was about finding purpose and meaning in a way that felt authentic to her. She wasn't pretending to be poor. She had a comfortable house and enough money to meet her needs. But she also wasn't pretending that her years of homelessness hadn't happened. She was integrating all parts of her experience into something new. Jonathan told her he was proud of her, and Margaret cried when she heard those words. She had spent so much of her life feeling like a disappointment to her family, feeling like she could never live up to the Ashford name. Now her brother was telling her that he was proud of the person she had become, not because of her money or her social status, but because of her choices and her character. It was a gift she hadn't known she needed. In 2003, Margaret agreed to do one public interview about her experience. She had received hundreds of requests over the years since her identity became known, but she had turned them all down. This time was different. A documentary filmmaker named Karen Rodriguez approached her with a proposal. Karen wanted to make a film not just about Margaret's story, but about the broader issues of homelessness, mental health, and wealth inequality in America. She wanted to use Margaret's experience as a starting point for examining why people become homeless and what it takes to help them recover. Margaret agreed on one condition. She wanted the documentary to include interviews with other formerly homeless individuals, not just her. She didn't want her story to be seen as unique or special. She wanted viewers to understand that every homeless person has a story, and most of those stories involve trauma, mental illness, or circumstances beyond their control. The documentary, titled Finding Margaret, premiered at a film festival in 2004. It received critical acclaim for its sensitive handling of difficult subject matter and won several awards. More importantly, it raised awareness about homelessness and mental health issues, sparking conversations that Margaret hoped might lead to real change in how society treats its most vulnerable members. The documentary also led to an unexpected connection. A woman named Sarah Mitchell reached out to Margaret after seeing the film. Sarah explained that she was the daughter of Dorothy Jensen, Margaret's former personal assistant, who had been one of the last people to see her before she disappeared. Dorothy had passed away in 1997, 3 years before Margaret was found. She had died without ever knowing what happened to the woman she had worked for and worried about for years. Sarah had grown up hearing stories about Margaret Ashford, about her mother's guilt and confusion over the disappearance. Dorothy had always wondered if she could have done something differently, if she had missed some sign that Margaret was in trouble. Sarah wanted Margaret to know that her mother had never stopped thinking about her, had never stopped hoping she was safe somewhere. Margaret was deeply moved by this information. She wished she could tell Dorothy in person how much she had appreciated her kindness, how none of what happened was Dorothy's fault. Since she couldn't do that, she did the next best thing. She established a scholarship fund in Dorothy Jensen's name, providing money for young people who wanted to study social work or psychology. It was a small way to honor the woman who had cared about her so many years ago. As the years passed, Margaret found a kind of peace with her unusual life story. She continued to live in Seattle, working with homeless services organizations and speaking occasionally at events about mental health and poverty. She remained close with Jonathan and his family, visiting them regularly in Connecticut. She maintained a relationship with James Patterson and Dr. Susan Chen, the two people who had first helped her transition back to having an identity. She dated occasionally but never married, feeling that she needed to be comfortable being alone with herself before she could truly share her life with someone else. She traveled sometimes, usually to places she had passed through during her homeless years, revisiting the cities where she had worked those odd jobs and lived in cheap motels. She found that remembering those times was less painful now. They were part of her story, part of who she had become. She was no longer ashamed of them. By 2010, 30 years after her initial disappearance, Margaret had found a rhythm to her life that felt sustainable and authentic. She had learned to manage her depression through medication, therapy, and a support network of people who understood her history. She had learned to accept both sides of herself, the wealthy Heiress and the homeless woman, as parts of a single, complex person. In 2015, Margaret did something that surprised many people who knew her story. She wrote a book. It wasn't a traditional memoir filled with dramatic revelations and shocking details. Instead, it was a thoughtful philosophical reflection on identity, wealth, poverty, and what it means to live an authentic life. She called it $5 and Everything. The title referred, of course, to the $5 bill she still carried in her wallet, but it also spoke to the larger themes of the book. Having everything, money, privilege, social status, hadn't made her happy. Having nothing, living on the streets with only $5, hadn't made her happy either. Happiness, she had learned, came from somewhere else entirely. It came from having a purpose, from making genuine connections with other people, from being honest about your struggles and accepting help when you need it. The book was not a bestseller, but it found a dedicated audience among people dealing with their own struggles with mental health, identity, or the pressure of expectations. Margaret received letters from readers telling her that her story had helped them feel less alone, had given them permission to admit they were struggling, had shown them that it was possible to rebuild after hitting bottom. These letters meant more to Margaret than any amount of money or social status ever had. One of the questions Margaret was asked most often was whether she had any regrets about her 20 years of homelessness. Her answer was always honest and complex. Yes. She regretted the pain she had caused her family, particularly her father, who died without knowing what happened to her. She regretted losing 2 decades of her life that she could never get back. She regretted the damage to her body from years of inadequate nutrition and lack of medical care. But she also felt that those 20 years had taught her things she needed to learn, had broken down parts of herself that needed to be broken down so she could rebuild in a healthier way. Would she recommend that path to anyone else? Absolutely not. There were better ways to find yourself, ways that didn't involve such extreme suffering. But given her personality, her mental state at the time, and the particular pressures she was under, she wasn't sure she would have learned those lessons any other way. She had needed to lose everything to understand what actually mattered. That was her story, and she had made her peace with it, even if it was a hard story to tell. Margaret's work with homeless services organizations led her to become an advocate for changes in how society addresses homelessness and mental illness. She used her wealth and her platform to push for more funding for mental health services, for housing first programs that provide people with stable shelter before requiring them to meet other conditions, and for better training for social workers and police officers who interact with homeless populations. She testified before city councils and state legislatures, bringing a perspective that few others could offer. She had been both a wealthy donor and a homeless recipient of services. She understood both sides in a way that gave her unique credibility. Some criticized her advocacy, saying that she couldn't really understand homelessness because she had always had the option to return to wealth, even if she hadn't exercised that option for 20 years. Margaret acknowledged this criticism and didn't try to claim that her experience was identical to someone who had truly never had any resources. But she pointed out that she had lived those 20 years without accessing her wealth, had experienced the same hunger, cold, fear, and marginalization that any homeless person experiences. Her experience was real, even if her circumstances were unusual, and she was using her unusual position to advocate for people who didn't have a voice or a platform. In 2018, Margaret was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. The diagnosis was frightening, but she had excellent medical care and caught it early enough that treatment was successful. The experience made her reflect on how different this medical crisis was from the health problems she had faced during her homeless years. Then, she had suffered from infections, dental problems, and malnutrition with no access to regular medical care. She had been to emergency rooms a few times when things got desperate, but she had no way to follow up with treatment or get prescription medications. The contrast between those experiences and her cancer treatment, with its teams of specialists, advanced technology, and comprehensive support, highlighted for her the profound inequality in healthcare access. She wrote an op-ed for a major newspaper about this disparity, using her own story to illustrate how much easier it is to stay healthy when you have resources, and how quickly health problems can spiral out of control when you don't. The piece went viral and sparked conversations about healthcare policy that Margaret hoped might lead to real change. She recovered fully from the cancer, but the experience left her even more committed to advocacy work. By 2020, 40 years after her initial disappearance, Margaret was 75 years old. She had lived as many years since being found as she had spent living on the streets. She continued her advocacy work, but at a slower pace, recognizing that she needed to be mindful of her health and energy. She had created a foundation that would continue her work after she was gone, funding homeless services and mental health programs throughout the country. She had established relationships with her nieces and nephews, and even their children, becoming a beloved if somewhat mysterious figure in the family. She spent more time reflecting on her life and what it all meant. She thought often about the question she had asked Dorothy Jensen so many years ago. Have you ever felt like your whole life is a beautiful prison? She understood now that the prison hadn't been her wealth or her family or her social obligations. The prison had been inside her own mind, created by depression and anxiety and the inability to accept herself. She had tried to escape by abandoning her old life, but she had taken the prison with her. It had taken decades of therapy, medication, hard experience, and the support of good people like James and Dr. Chen to finally break free. The real escape hadn't been about geography or money. It had been about accepting all parts of herself, the darkness and the light, and learning to live with that complexity. Margaret Ashford still carries that $5 bill in her wallet. She is now in her late 70s, living quietly in Seattle, continuing to work with homeless services when her health permits. She has never stopped being both people, the wealthy Heiress and the homeless woman. She exists in the space between those two extremes, trying to use the advantages of one to address the suffering she experienced in the other. When people ask her if she's happy now, she thinks carefully before answering. Happiness is not a constant state, she has learned. It comes and goes like weather. But she has something more important than happiness. She has authenticity. She is genuinely herself, not performing a role or hiding behind a facade. She knows who she is, even if that knowledge came at an enormous cost. The woman who vanished with $350 million and was found with 5 has learned what most people never fully grasp, that wealth and poverty are both temporary conditions. But who you are at your core remains constant. The question is whether you have the courage to look at that core honestly, to accept what you find there, and to build a life that honors your true self rather than the person others expect you to be. Margaret did that work, though it took her 40 years and cost her almost everything. In the end, though, she found something worth more than all the money she inherited. She found herself. And that, she would tell you if you asked, was worth every hard year, every cold night, every moment of doubt and fear. Because now, finally, she knows the answer to the question that drove her into the streets all those years ago. This is who she is, and she is enough.